Now, let's talk about the gender pay gap, which is not just something that affects women in Ireland. This is an EU issue. Jennifer Keane from Paygap IE has been having a look at it. Jennifer, tell us about how women are losing out.
Hi, so the European Trade Union Institute released a study today, and it's actually one they've done a couple of times. They repeat it every few years, where they look at what the situation would be if there was a 10% reduction in the gender pay gap as a result of pay transparency. And they've found that the average female worker will be €672 a year poorer compared to if we had seen that 10% reduction. So collectively, across all the women working in all the companies covered by this in the EU, will lose 28 billion a year compared to if there was a 10% reduction.
Okay, but just explain this a little bit more. Does this mean across many jobs that if a man and woman are doing the same job, they're not necessarily getting the same pay, and in most cases that the man is getting more than the woman?
It's not quite as simple. Often the gender pay gap is really a reflection of whether women are progressing in a company, whether there are women represented in senior leadership in a company, because the figure takes into account the whole company, right? So when you look at figures for senior leadership pay, for example, that can obviously skew the figure if most of the senior leadership team are male. And that is still the case for many, many companies throughout the EU and in Ireland. So that means that when you look at companies that have a large pay gap, it's not necessarily that they are paying women less. It's often a reflection that there just aren't women represented in that industry, in that company, or in senior leadership in that company.
Why does there seem to be a reluctance on the part of many companies to report to the authorities? And why is there a reluctance on the part of many governments to enforce mandatory reporting?
How I wish I knew the answer. I don't know. And I think that companies are really missing an opportunity and a trick here, because the opportunity is there for you to explain your gap, to talk about what you're doing to change it, to maybe talk about positive improvements in your company. And the opportunity is missed there for our government to be taking advantage of the improved participation in the workforce by women. Everyone misses out when we don't have women in the workforce. And I don't understand why people don't want to sort of take the opportunity also to just be able to look at their own data and to be able to see in real time, are the things they are doing making an impact? That seems like a tremendous opportunity to me. I think it's also going to increasingly become a recruitment issue, where if your gender pay gap is not good and you don't seem to be doing anything to change it, you'll find that people will look that up before submitting a CV, and they simply may not ever submit that CV to you.
Okay, number of questions coming in from listeners, Jennifer. One says, does the gender pay gap take into account the time that a person has served in a company?
The way our reporting structure is calculated, no, that's not really calculated into it in that way. Kind of an analogue for that might be seniority in a company or in a role, but there's not a specific figure in there for length of time in a role.
Another one, if a woman takes time off for maternity leave, will this affect salary levels?
Very much so. Maternity leave is still one of the biggest contributors to the pay gap, because most women, you'll have to take maternity leave if you are going to have a baby, and you very likely will lose money on that, either because your company doesn't pay maternity leave or because paid maternity leave only lasts so long, and most women can't get a child into a creche until they're about a year old, which means there's a gap. So although people think of women as voluntarily taking unpaid leave, most women have to take unpaid leave at the end of paid maternity leave to cover that gap. So that often contributes to then a gap in salary level when they return, and also for that entire period that they take off work.
And then does it also impact on their ability to gain promotions? Promotions may have been granted in the time when they were off work.
It can do, and it often does. Again, one of the biggest contributors, because the gender pay gap isn't just a point in time, it's a lifetime gap, right? It might be 11% right now, but that becomes more compounded when you are taking multiple leaves, when maybe you have to take time off to care for a parent or a child when they're unwell. It stacks up to a gap in your pension as well. So every one of those leaves compounds, and you're spot on that it impacts the ability to even be considered sometimes for promotions and progression also.
Listener says, I get paid €14,000 less than my male work colleagues, and they are less skillful than I am. I often have to help them out and correct their mistakes. Even new men were started on 5,000 more than what I started on. Is that legal? Are you allowed to start men coming into a job for the first time on a higher pay rate than women coming into the same job?
So it's very challenging because our current law makes it quite hard for people to take cases and establish whether that is or isn't legal. It should be equal pay for equal work. That is absolutely the law. But our current law makes it very hard for people to take individual pay cases, because in the case of that listener, for example, they would have to prove that they have been paid unfairly. It's usually very hard for one individual to find that information. One of the things that's quite disappointing, and it's true that sometimes they are, but part of the reason I encourage people to look at the pay gap in a more nuanced way is we have to ask the why of that. Why are more men able to avail of those overtime hours? Is it lack of access to childcare? Is it expectation on who's doing the childcare? Is it a lack of ability to find childcare at a weekend or at odd shift patterns? Most childcare places close, at kind of office hours. They close at maybe 6, maybe 7 p.m. if you're lucky, which means that many women are simply unable to take advantage. So yes, it is the case that more men work those hours, but we really have to scrape the surface and understand why can more men work those hours.
Thank you very much, Jennifer Keane, creator of Paygap.ie. Back with a 5 of 5 after this.
The last word
with Live Pharmacy.